Okay, so are you ready to dig into this interview with Kamala Harris?
Always up for a good political deep dive,
Right.
especially if an election right around the corner.
This one was interesting.
Yeah,
You know, journalist Bret Baier sat down with her,
I saw that.
and let's just say he did not hold back.
Oh, really?
Yeah, especially on immigration.
Which is interesting because they did this interview in Pennsylvania,
Yeah,
big swing state.
huge,
And immigration is like front and center for a lot of voters there.
for sure.
So it's a strategic choice for sure to do the interview there.
Absolutely. And Baier, he really pressed her right from the start.
Oh, look.
On the number of illegal immigrants that have been released into the U.S. since Biden took office.
I can imagine that's a tense topic.
Yeah, so he throws out this number.
Okay.
6 million.
6 million.
6 million is the estimate.
Wow, that's a big number.
And it really puts things into perspective, right?
It does, no matter where you fall in the political spectrum, that number is
Yeah.
going to make people stop and think.
For sure. And it connects to this other part of the interview that I found really powerful.
Okay.
So he brings up these two young women, Jocelyn Unguri and Lake Riley.
Those names sound familiar.
They were tragically killed by individuals who were released early on in Biden's presidency.
Oh, right. I remember that those cases were all over the news.
Yeah, so Baier plays this audio clip of Nunguri's mother,
Oh, wow.
and she is just
I bet.
completely heartbroken, and she blames the Biden administration's policies directly for her daughter's death.
Wow, that must have been a really intense moment,
It was, and it really puts VP Harris in a tough spot.
to put it mildly.
Yeah, so how do you respond to that kind of raw grief and anger?
I mean, how can you even begin to address that as a politician,
Right.
especially when you're the one being blamed?
Exactly. So
Yeah.
so how does she handle it?
Well, she did express sorrow for the families, of course,
Mhm.
but then she kind of pivoted to talking about the need for immigration reform.
Okay.
And she even pointed the finger at the previous administration.
So kind of a classic political move.
Yeah, I mean, you acknowledge the tragedy, but you don't necessarily accept blame.
Right.
It's a delicate balance.
It makes you wonder how much is genuine empathy and how much is just
Strategy.
exactly. And that leads us to another really interesting point that I want to dig into.
Okay, with that.
Because she kept saying, we have to follow the law
Oh.
when it came to immigration.
Right.
And that really stood out to me, especially when you think back to some of her earlier positions on immigration.
Oh, you mean like back when she was running for president in 2020?
Yeah, you could say her stance has shifted a bit since then.
Maybe more than a bit.
Right.
I mean, depending on how you look at it.
Exactly, and that's what we're going to unpack next.
I'm intrigued. Tell me more. Yeah, so back in 2019,
Okay,
she was all about driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants,
right.
even talked about free tuition-free health care.
A little different from saying we have to follow the law, right?
Yeah, you could say that.
So how do you explain that kind of shift?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it really gets at this tension between campaigning
Yeah.
and actually governing.
Right,
When you're running for office, you can promise the world.
sure.
You're trying to appeal to a specific base of voters. You want them fired up.
Get out the vote.
Exactly. But then you get into office and suddenly you have to work within these existing systems.
And laws.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And that's where things get complicated.
for sure. So is she saying she's changed her mind?
I don't know. It's hard to say.
Or is it more like a calculated shift in messaging?
Maybe she feels like she has to appeal to a broader base of voters now.
That makes you wonder.
And there's this one part in the interview that really stood out to me.
Okay.
Baier asks her directly about this apparent contradiction.
What does she say?
She insists that her stance has always been consistent.
Really?
But then she says, and I quote, "I will follow the law."
So which is it?
Right? It's like she's saying, I believe this, but my hands are tied.
Because the law is the law.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what makes this so interesting for voters.
It's because it's like, who are you really?
Are you the candidate who is pushing for these progressive policies?
Or are you the vice president who's bound by the law?
And more importantly, do those two things even have to be mutually exclusive?
That's a really good question, and it gets at this bigger issue of trust.
Absolutely.
Can we trust politicians to actually fight for what they believe in?
Even when it's difficult.
Even when it means maybe breaking with their party or going against the grain?
Or do we accept that they're going to make compromises along the way?
These are tough questions.
You really are.
And they apply to so many issues, not just immigration.
Exactly.
Speaking of which, Baier didn't shy away from other hot-button topics either.
Like what?
Well, he grilled her on the economy, for one thing.
Oh, interesting, because she's been saying that their economic plans are stronger than the other side's.
Right, but then you look at the polling data, and it
Same.
seems like voters aren't so sure.
Really?
Yeah, they seem to trust the other side more when it comes to the economy.
Huh. So there's a disconnect there somewhere.
That's what I was thinking.
Between the message and how it's being received.
Exactly. And it made me think about her whole campaign slogan, "A New Way Forward."
I've been wondering about that one myself.
If that's the message, what exactly is she moving forward from?
Her own party. Her own administration's track record.
Right. It's like, is this actually a new direction?
Or is it more the same just with different packaging?
It's tricky.
For sure.
And then there's the whole Iran situation, which I have to say,
Yeah.
this part of the interview was unexpected. Baier asks her point blank, what's the biggest threat facing the U.S. right now? And she says, Iran.
Interesting.
Right. Because you've got a lot of people saying China is the bigger global threat.
Even some pretty high up people in intelligence.
Exactly. Like, remember when the FBI director himself called China the biggest threat we face?
Yeah, that was a pretty big deal.
So it's kind of a bold move for her to come out and say Iran is the bigger problem.
It's definitely a choice.
Right. And I'm curious, did she explain why she landed on Iran?
She did.
Okay, what did she say?
So she talked about the immediate threat to Israel,
Which makes sense.
being a key U.S. ally and all.
All right. The U.S. has always been a strong supporter of Israel.
Absolutely. And she talked about her role in addressing those recent attacks.
Right, I remember that.
And how she's committed to keeping Israel safe.
Which is obviously a huge priority for any U.S. administration.
No doubt about it.
The Middle East is like a powder keg, and Israel's right in the middle of it.
Exactly. And by focusing on Iran, it gives her an opening to draw a contrast with her opponent.
Because he's been more hands-off with Iran.
Right. She criticized his approach to the Iran nuclear deal, for example.
Right. And his whole foreign policy in the region.
It's classic campaign strategy. Highlight your strengths and downplay your weaknesses.
For sure. But it also raises the question of who's right.
Who do you trust more to handle these complex foreign policy challenges?
Right. Because at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to, trust.
Absolutely.
And leadership.
Exactly. Who do you want leading the country making those tough calls?
Especially on the world stage.
Because those decisions have real consequences.
They do. And it makes you think back to something else VP Harris said in this interview.
About what?
About how her presidency wouldn't just be a continuation of the Biden administration.
Oh, right. A new way forward.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But how do you square that with everything we've just been talking about?
Yeah. I mean, she's been a part of this administration for the past 4 years.
Right.
Yeah.
So is it really possible to just hit the reset button?
And even if it is, what does that actually look like in practice?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. And it's something for voters to think about as they head to the polls.
Because this election isn't just about the past 4 years, it's about the next 4.
And beyond.
It's about what kind of country we want America to be on the world stage and here at home.
Exactly. And that's why these conversations are so important.
They are. We have to keep asking the tough questions, digging deeper, looking beyond the sound bites.
And most importantly, making our voices heard.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. But remember, this is just the beginning of the conversation.
Exactly. Don't stop here. Keep learning, keep thinking, keep engaging with these issues.
And most importantly, get out there and vote because your voice matters.
It really does.
Thanks for joining us.